Thank you. Thank you for organizers for having me here. I'm here already on a regular basis discussing InfoWar and then Russian propaganda, but that is just the extent of the problem, illustration of the problem that we have. And Michael, you probably realize that we are in a kind of an InfoWar front, so the questions are boiling up, so that's the usual kind of a tradition. But I would like maybe still to pick up where you have left and really kind of to stress my several points as a starter ones. First being that I actually think when we are discussing disinformation, fake news, and generally such kind of aggressive info-war strategies, it's really not just about elections. I mean, it's a constant situation for years in this region. Unfortunately, our Western partners simply learned that by the pain of Lisa the girl story in Berlin, your own fake news experiences, and this is how this became a new trend to discuss the challenges. And what I mean by saying that this is not just about the elections, I think elections, to be straightforward, is just a kind of a window of opportunity for all of us finally to take important strategic decisions on policy, on institutions, and really to keep them going after the elections are done and we have another elections and not just elections. Now, the other point is, I agree, it's not about just Russia. I think the genius of Kremlin's aggressive strategies is that they showed the example and now they are simply outsourcing this kind of strategies for anyone to pick up. And the best way I think it was described is by Anton Shekhotsov is this tango noir now, or those populist movements that simply see the same opportunity to use those strategies, and then Russia is like just rubbing their hands. It's not them, but it's still the way how those strategies came about. And just a final third point as a starter one, I think when we are, there's another risk when we discuss disinformation and fake news, is that we are leaving apart or a bit of a kind of a forgetting the traditional Kremlin's modus operandi during the elections. And disinformation, active measures were just a bit apart, an important part, but still the main factors were usually, I would say, corruption, this dark relationships between oligarchs and Gazprom money and things like that. And this is still the modus operandi, is that just it is added with this disinformation being a kind of a multiplier in some cases. So I had several slides as well, if I may, to back some points. So in this case, when we are then turning our attention to this story of fake or history of fake, just to stress that the things that I'm started with, I think we are entering a kind of an age of dark power, as related to the age of soft power that was a big trend, like 10 years or more ago. And this social platforms is really a good environment for this dark power strategies. I mentioned already that it is a kind of a being outsourced for others. The best probable example from our region, a recent one, was during elections, parliamentary elections in Estonia, where Conservative People's Party youth wing politician candidates simply chose to create fake social networks accounts on his behalf, and he created a kind of a virtual visibility of his agenda and so on. And the interesting story behind it was that the journalist researched this from Estonian public broadcast, and now, as I follow, they are under attack by the same party leaders as being biased, and so on and so on. So that is again an unfortunate story of journalists who go and tackle the challenges, the stories, and they face the unfortunate consequences. When we are discussing the way all this info war is going on, I would add a point that it's really not so much about information warfare, it's more of a war against information that we are faced here, and even, I would say, a kind of a war against democracy, a bit of sound words here, but the idea here is that the way Kremlin or para-Kremlin entities play this card is really they corrupt our democratic processes layer by layer. What I mean by that, they deceive themselves as RT or others to be a journalistic outlet. Or we have players who deceive themselves as being election monitors, giving the example of CIS-EMO, those who follow the fake election monitors playing this card, and so on. And the third additional point here is that I'm actually getting not into the recipes of how to heal the disease, but really describing the grave disease we are maybe in, is that it's even the way we discuss fake news or fakes. In the end, I hope you all see and hear that this just became a new, how to say, name-calling technique by the politicians to name everyone, you know, critical of them being fake. We had the situation in Lithuania where our Lithuanian public broadcast was dragged into the political battles, and in the end there were protests, and now the situation, as I mentioned, similar situation is going on in Estonia with the Estonian public broadcaster. So even our language about this challenge has been hijacked. I mean, fake news, if we want to really challenge the fake news, suddenly politicians are pointing fingers to the critical journalists that they are the fakes and so on. So I would like now to turn to Lithuanian experiences with a screenshot from the most recent info attack we had just several weeks ago, and to use this as an illustration a bit in describing the situation basically we have locally. This is an ending of a video which was generally a more complex campaign against our Minister of Defense. And the ending, the screenshot here, you can see in the back there's this Lithuania for Lithuanians slogan. And here's the rubbish bin, and the old politicians should go into this rubbish bin. That's the election context here. But the whole video, up to several minutes, was about how the politicians are being corrupted by military complex and military money and NATO and so on. So my point in this here is that if we look into Lithuanian experience, recent one, I'm not saying that it couldn't go more ugly and specifically into election topic, but in Lithuania now, the general target for disinformation and fake news is NATO, NATO partners, specifically German soldiers or German battalion leaders, and in the end even Minister of Defense as a kind of a representing the defense sector. and it just ends with the idea of elections and potential change and so on. So elections here is a kind of a context for what I would call a kind of a micro campaigns, aggressive operations, which are just simply testing the ground, maybe, or testing our defenses in some respect. I would say that we are kind of getting into a new era from old fakes, the ones traditional, you know, with the traditional news cycle, traditional dissemination through rumors or forged letters, through outside placement, and then spinning through traditional Cold War Communist International, into new fakes era where we have a live and breaking news cycle. The placement is very much on the social platforms. In our case, in Lithuanian experience, we have sleeping cells being virtual bloggers or Facebook groups, closed Facebook groups, open Facebook groups, and then they start the campaigning or the ops. Then there's, of course, hacking part in it. The same case, the recent one, was done through hacking into the newspapers and placing in articles as well. The interesting part on D-Day, as I say, through those campaigns is the timing when the campaigns start, when some important political events are being debated and discussed out. When the question mark, here I have it with the effect, I really think that we are in the situation right now where this is a Russian word for razvedka boyam. Or the intelligence in the way of a small battle, simply testing our defenses. Because in some respects, those fakes are quite clumsy. They are not amplified later, but they are quite complex to really see how well we are prepared. And I wanted to point, the final point here is that, having all this in mind, let us not please forget the general modus operandi by Kremlin in our political systems, in our elections. Meaning that basically it always is a complex strategy with corruption, dark money, you know, political energy, or money being used, and all the fakes or disinformation is just an additional part. And I would like to end with, I don't know, a kind of a cherry maybe on top from old days, with a photo of a guy whom we discussed out here in Latvia with my colleagues on information warfare already 15 years ago, as I remember. There was a seminar on Russian information warfare strategies in 2005, if I'm right, in Latvian military academy. It was the first, probably, instances where we try to understand what we are really faced with, and we were looking into the authors or experts who were describing Russian information warfare strategies. So this guy is Sergei Pavlovich Rastorguyev. The computer is as old as the photo, and it's just a representation of how old this thinking was already. And the thinking by this guy was of the strategy how to influence foreign neighboring societies through the means of information operations or infowar strategies. Just a short off-topic, he died just several years ago, and because of promemorias that were written in Russia, it was made public that at the same time he was a FSB colonel doing a very specific institutional work. But basically his materials were on the way how you influence the societies. So I want just to show you his strategic thinking on how we are discussing right now the challenges of social resilience or immunity of our society towards such kind of influences. And just to illustrate how deep thinking was behind those Infowar strategies is that at that time it was already considered to be a kind of a virus operations or influence operations throughout going around the filters that we have. And he gave the examples of biological infection or biological virus, which can be, considered alarmistic, and the way, Russians sometimes discuss those issues, I totally agree that we have to take with a lot of, critical grain of salt, all of those ideas. But then he went further, speaking about e-infection, social infection, ending with information infections being effective and going through our filters. And he ended up this by saying that the offender can always adapt towards the defenses. And the best way he considered was when opponent puts on this, he called it the turtle shell strategy. Then you can go around it, and if you do it formally, strictly, there are always ways to really go around it. And when we are now discussing this, this approach towards our defenses, I just want to visually keep you with the thinking of where we should orient our energy in debating how effectively to defend ourselves. I would say that the main target shouldn't be this turtle shell strategy that is the outer layer of this information space, putting, strict legal frameworks which are necessary in general, of course, situation, but to be more creative and more effective on this mid-layer, I would call it maybe information culture or general filter of being more effective on our own strategic communication, our own conduct of practices through, social platforms, journalists, and so on. But I think this should be the focus of our defenses and debates about our immunity and social resilience. With this, I would like to stop. And as I said, it's not about golden recipes, more of the grave situation with this disease that we are into. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nerijus. Thank you also about your academic touch in your presentation. I wanted to also ask, you described all this difficult situation in Lithuania, and that in some kind you are also as a test field from the side of attack information warfare. But during this Lithuanian way how to tackle disinformation, do you see any signs that Lithuania is moving towards more censored online space?
I would say that there is no clear line, not just in Lithuania, but generally maybe in our region, to which direction we are moving. From our experiences, what we really bring out as our kind of own lessons learned is that we really are quite moving forward with our strategic communication cells, and we are quite vocal about our bottom-up approach of building Stratcom capabilities, not generally in government, but in our different ministries, and then growing this to the top. Now there's the discussion and debate on how to really coordinate this up to the government level. Then we are kind of doing a creative approach of tackling the same trolls. If mythology, then mythology. We have those elves as a brand to fight the trolls. I really see it as a quite effective brand where you really create this mystique, and you can recruit potential elves to follow the disinformation, to tackle fake news, to become those digital Sherlocks, which is now again a hashtag, but to be active in this fight. And the last point here is that I think there's this quite good social human layer or fabric of human cooperation in the journalistic communities when we speak about debunking projects, or how journalists try to deconstruct fakes. It's not the very examples of those fakes, but the practices, how they intercommunicate with each other, that enable them to be more proactive, more quick, more effective when the new fake appears, and really to be this kind of a human filter, not to amplify the disinformation later for general audiences.
Thank you, Nerijus, again. And our last speaker is Jon Kist.